Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandre Pacheco da Silva, and this is Challenges for Copyright Reform in Brazil, a set of interviews with incredible scholars to discuss copyright in a digital society. I'm a law professor at São Paulo Law School at Getúlio Vargas Foundation and one of the coordinators of the Center for Education and Research in Innovation. Today, we have Professor Michael Handler from the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law. Professor Handler researches in the field of intellectual property law, focus in national and international trademark law, the international regulation of geographical indications of origin, and copyright law. Professor Handler has written numerous of peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and he also co-authors different books. For instance, the Australian Intellectual Property Commentary, Law and Practice. I'm very happy to have Professor Handler with us today. In 2020, I had the privilege of visiting the University of New South Wales at the invitation of Professor Handler, who introduced me to professors with projects in different fields of law, with the main focus of law and technology. And Professor Handler, it's a privilege, and I'm very happy to have you with us today for a discussion that I'm very interested in, that is copyright. And not only copyright, but copyright reform. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being today with us. So, Professor Handler, I have a first question for our conversation today with you. That is, and I will give you a little bit of context to actually present this question for you. So I would say that copyright exceptions and limitations are a key aspect of current debates on copyright reform. While some jurisdictions access the legality of unauthorized uses of protected work based on case law constructions, such as the fair use doctrine. For instance, the United States is a good example for that. Others, such as Brazil, prefer to establish copyright limitation in statutory provisions. So either of those approaches pose advantages and disadvantages, such as varying degrees of legal security and legislation that is somewhat adaptable to technological change. Generally, do you believe that lawmakers should establish strict rules for copyright limitations and exceptions, or that they are better off leaving them to be construed by case law? So thank you to be a part of this project again.
And thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to join you today. And thank you for that question, which is an excellent one and really gets to the heart of, I think, contemporary debates over copyright exceptions. As you know, there's been, I think, a really significant renewed interest in copyright exceptions around the world over the last 25 or 30 years. And in particular, I think amongst countries like Australia and the UK and Canada, as well as Israel and Singapore and others, countries that have traditionally had that second model that you talked about, what we might call a closed list model of exceptions that are defined by ex ante rules. The concerns have been expressed in those countries about the adequacy of that closed list regime, and in particular about whether it's adequate, what we might call for future-proofing copyright, whether those exceptions that adhere to a closed list are adequate to ensure that users can innovate by using other copyright materials, that they can engage in freedom of expression with those materials. Put simply, that they can engage in a full range of beneficial uses of copyright materials that don't harm the copyright owner's legitimate interests. And there's a concern that the closed list model might not adequately facilitate that, and that such regimes aren't fully future-proofed. There are also concerns in those countries with the closed list model about the adequacy of the drafting of those rules. Like, it's one thing to say that you can set up a lot of rules about what you can and can't do with copyright in advance, and that provides certainty to users. But there's been a lot of concern in those countries about the adequacy of that as a drafting model. That if you take that approach of trying to set up rules in advance about what you can and can't do, almost invariably those rules become too narrow in their scope. There's something about that drafting model that means that countries gravitate towards overly restrictive models. So there, I think, some of the concerns that we've seen in reform debates over the last 25 or so years. Now, I think your question is more about what might be the optimal model, which might be the better model, the more of a US, an open-ended fair use model that relies perhaps more on an open-ended standard, or a model, an improved model that is based on rules about what you can and can't do. My own view, and I think something that's worth thinking about, is that it's useful to think about copyright exceptions in terms of whether a standard or a rule is desirable. But I think it's also important to think that those two things don't operate as binaries, that you can have, you can adopt a standard of protection that actually in operation becomes more like a set of rules, or equally you can have, a set of rules, but they're fairly flexible and open-ended. They end up operating more like standards. So I think seeing standards and rules on a continuum is particularly important. And I'd encourage viewers to perhaps look at the work of Emily Hudson in her recent book, Drafting Copyright Exceptions, who examines this notion of copyright exceptions operating as potential standards or rules. My own view is that I have a preference for countries that have adopted rule-based models, closed-list models, to think seriously about moving to the fair use standard. And why I think that's potentially advantageous is because fair use as a standard does actually operate with a set of underlying rules. I think if a country were to think about adopting fair use, it would be important to recognize that it's not simply a vague, completely open-ended standard. It would operate with a set of underlying rules. And I think it would do so in a couple of ways. One is that a country, whether it's Australia or Brazil or another country considering fair use, they could look to foreign countries that have a fair use standard in place and look at the case law that has developed in those countries for guidance as to how a fair use defense might operate. So that means that the open-ended standard becomes more rule-like in operation. And that helps provide a great, more certainty in how that standard might operate. For readers who are interested in the idea of fair use operating in that more rule-like way with a greater degree of certainty, some leading US scholars have written, I think, really strong works on this. Pamela Samuelson, Barton Beebe, Matthew Sagg have all written about the predictability of fair use in operation through case law. So that's one way in which the fair use standard can become more rule-like. And a second way is that the fair use standard can become more rule-like is through the development of custom. That can be through guidelines, best practice guides. These can be developed by subsets of users that can develop a set of practices as to what uses might be fair in given situations. So in the absence of case law clarifying what the fair use standard looks like, custom can help provide some of that guidance. And here I would recommend to listeners the work of Patricia Alfter-Heider and Peter Yazzie, in particular their book Reclaiming Fair Use, looking at how, in particular in documentary film and other areas, how these best practice guidelines offer users a reasonable degree of certainty as to what copyright material they can freely use. Neva Elkan-Koren and some of her work in Israel in the development of best practice guidelines is also very useful here. But I think a final point to note is that even though I think that's my personal preference, that fair use does provide a reasonable degree of certainty, it's a standard that operates in that rule-like way. I think we need to be careful not to dismiss the alternatives. And so it is possible to stay within what we might call a closed list model, but as long as we ensure that that closed list is drafted sufficiently broadly to be looking towards the future, to allow users to engage in the use of copyright material that is socially beneficial, that enhances freedom of expression. That is still possible within a closed list model. It is possible to imagine, for example, a range of fairness defences limited by broadly expressed purposes, socially beneficial uses like criticism, review, research, quotation, use for user-generated content, technical and incidental use, text data mining. If the purposes are expressed very generally and broadly, that might give users a great deal of comfort as well. So while I think my personal preference is for fair use, it is possible to envisage what we might call expanded fair dealing operating to achieve broadly similar outcomes.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your answer. And a second question that I would like to ask you, Professor Handler, it is speaking about the Australian experience. And in 2015 and 2018, Australia amended the 1968 Copyright Act with the goal of improving treatment of copyright infringement on the internet. And more recently, the government has presented new proposals directed at updating exceptions to copyright and improving access to protected works for non-commercial and education purposes, among other subjects that they changed that. What's your view on the recent moves from Australia towards copyright reform? Are there any specific upsides or downsides that you would like to highlight here and actually help us to understand this movement as a possibility to go here in Brazil?
That's a great question as well. And you're right to identify there's been a lot of reform activity in Australia, not just, I think, going back to 2015, but I think to answer your question fully, I might go back about another 10 years. The issue of copyright exceptions reform has been one that has been given a great deal of attention by law reform bodies, but I would say, unfortunately, I think less critical attention by the government. Australia has a closed list model. We have a limited number of fair dealing defences that are limited by some quite strictly drafted purposes. For example, fair dealing by the researcher, fair dealing for criticism of the work being copied. We also have a fair dealing for parody and satire exception. Beyond that, we don't have an open-ended fair use type defense. We have around 70 very tightly drafted exceptions covering things like the incidental use in running computers, use of computer programs for interoperability and testing, use of artistic works in certain circumstances. So very tightly drafted, purpose-limited exceptions. There have been a number of law reform inquiries that have considered whether that's the right model to continue with. And the most important of these took place about 10 years ago now. It was the body called the Australian Law Reform Commission, which is an independent body that is given the task by the Attorney General to consider law reform in particular areas, and it was given the task of considering the adequacy of Australia's copyright exceptions in the digital era. The Australian Law Reform Commission's primary recommendation in its report, it's called the report number 122, Copyright in the Digital Economy. Its primary recommendation was that Australia should adopt a fair use defence to copyright infringement and should repeal a quite large number of the purpose-specific exceptions. It had a secondary recommendation. It recognised that politically it might be difficult to move to fair use, and so it suggested that if fair use were thought to be undesirable, Australia should significantly expand the purposes of its fair dealing defences, have very broad, open-ended purposes for things like criticism, review, quotation, incidental use, education. That report was not acted on by the government at the time. About 3 years later, the government's primary body looking at economic reform, called the Productivity Commission, they separately recommended that Australia should adopt a fair use defence to infringement. There was also some economic modelling that was commissioned by the government that was released at the same time that indicated that the benefits, the economic benefits to Australia of moving to fair use or expanded fair dealing were greater than the economic benefits of maintaining the current model. So I think the lessons there are that it's possible to set up inquiries and to have those inquiries consult broadly with stakeholders. And for those who are interested in reform, to make a strong case. I think those seeking reform were able to have their voices heard in these inquiries and able to persuade those inquiries that expanding Australia's copyright exceptions was forward. So that's a real positive, I think, about what's happened in Australia. I think the willingness of these law reform bodies to listen to all stakeholders or to recommend an optimal outcome. So that's the positive. Unfortunately, as I said, I think our government's response has not been as positive. The government since early 2014 has been resistant to the recommendations of these multiple inquiries. It has not been willing to contemplate fair use. It hasn't provided strong counter arguments. It has just shown an unwillingness to contemplate, I think, really meaningful change. Instead, it has persisted with the old model by adding more exceptions. Now, some of those have been beneficial. We achieved new exceptions in 2017, allowing for access to copyright material for those with disabilities. I think they were positive. But unfortunately, at the moment, the government has very recently released, this is very late in 2021, proposals to make only minor incremental changes to the Copyright Act. And one of those is to add a new fair dealing for quotation exception. And unfortunately, it shows all of the problems of the 20th century model. It's a very narrowly drafted, purpose-limited exception. It contains all of these qualifications. For example, it's not a general quotation exception. It can only be relied upon by those operating libraries or the government or by researchers. So it's not available to everybody. It has to be for a non-commercial purpose. So separate from any fairness factors, only non-commercial quotation. It's also, what's being proposed is the drafting is so complex and unclear that it's likely to lead to a situation where those who might wish to rely on the exception will not have any confidence that what they do falls within the scope of the exception. And that, I think, is unfortunately a hallmark of the closed list model, these narrowly, confusingly drafted exceptions that only create certainty in setting up a situation where, as a user, you know that there's a very strong chance that you will infringe. That's the only certainty you have. You don't have certainty that if you seek to rely on the defence, you'll be able to. So unfortunately, what is being proposed by the government, I think, is falling back on the old model and is not an optimal way forward. So that's I think coming back to your question, I think that's one of the downsides about the approach that's been taken in Australia. I think an unwillingness of the government to listen to and accept the recommendations of the independent law reform inquiries that have taken place.
Thank you very much, Professor Handler. And my final question for you, it is regarding the Brazilian context. Basically, it is if you could give an advice to the Brazilian policymakers interested in updating Brazilian copyright law, what would you say to them? What would be a good fit to actually start this type of movement here in Brazil? Because we have a lot of proposals, but usually we not go forward with them. So what would be your advice for us?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think there are a number of ideas that should be taken really quite seriously. I think setting up an independent law reform inquiry is a really valuable step. I think it's this is an area that I'm sure you know, Alex, and I think many listeners would, is highly polarized. There are those who are very strongly in favor of reform and can make a strong case for it. But on the other hand, there are those, I think, particularly many content owners and rights holders who are highly resistant to any change. So we're dealing with a very polarized debate here. And I think one of the ways through that is to have an independent inquiry where all stakeholders' views can be ventilated. I think that's really important, that all participants are given the opportunity to write submissions, to present views at roundtables. I think one of the reasons why the Australian Law Reform Commission's report and the Productivity Commission's reports were so well respected is because of the quality of the process that was involved. You know, these were very well run, well considered, evidence-based inquiries. So I think that's really important. That's one bit of advice. I think another bit of advice would be to look broadly. That this is not simply an issue that will be unique to Brazil. I think any country can learn a great deal from what other countries have gone through over the last 20 years. So a second piece of advice would be to look closely at the path of reform that has taken place in multiple countries. For example, Israel and its move towards a fair use defence around 15 years ago would be quite instructive. And not just, I think, the move towards the defence, but also what has happened since. So Israel, I think, is an excellent example of a country that moved to a new model, but which appears to be functioning very well. And so to get a sense of how fair use has functioned in Israel over the last 15 years by dealing with Israeli policymakers and scholars would be useful. Equally, looking at Singapore's experience. Singapore has recently enacted a brand new Copyright Act, expanding its copyright exceptions, looking at its reform processes and how it got there is important. And then perhaps the more obvious foreign countries to look at, the US experience, looking at what's happening in the EU and Canada, all of that's instructive. But I think looking to countries that have made moves away from the closed list model towards fair use will be particularly illustrative. So that's, I think, a second piece of advice. And the last one is simply to learn from the Australian experience and don't think that a consensus model is the best way forward. I think that's really one of the problems of the Australian approach. It's this idea that it's only if you can get some consensus that you can move towards law reform. That's what I think is so disappointing, that we've had independent inquiries make a very strong case in favour of fair use, but it seems that the government is unwilling to move and adopt that position because some stakeholders remain opposed. I think that's the wrong way forward. I think what that means is that you end up with these heavily compromised and ultimately inadequate solutions that are designed to appease everyone, but will end up appealing to nobody. So I think holding firm in the face of opposition is vitally important here. And why I say that is because I believe that the case for expanding copyright exceptions, in particular adopting fair use, is a strong one, and it has been made repeatedly in multiple countries around the world. And I think it's really important for governments to recognise the strength of the case as really motivating reform, or should animate reform, rather than the idea that, well, because that case might not appeal to some stakeholders, we shouldn't go ahead with it. So staying firm, I think, in the face of strong opposition is going to be important here for if Brazil wishes to go down this path.
Thank you very much, Professor Handler. It was a wonderful time that we share here with your answer, with our answers, with your view regarding those complex topics, but I think topics that we needed to face here in Brazil. We need to think about this in the public discussion here in Brazil. So thank you very much to be a part of this project, and thank you very much to share your time with us today.
Thanks very much, Alex. A pleasure.
And to our audience, see you next time. Please comment on the video and send us doubts, comments, and engage with our content. Thank you. See you next time.